October 23, 1863, Chattanooga, Tennessee. The Tennessee River moves slowly here, brown and heavy with autumn mud, cutting a bend through the valley like a scar that never healed. The mountains rise on every side. Lookout Mountain to the southwest, a dark wall of timber and rock jutting 1,000 feet into the gray sky. Missionary Ridge to the east, a long spine of Confederate earthworks stretching for miles, bristling with artillery. The air smells of wood smoke and rot, of wet wool and horse manure, of men who haven't bathed in weeks because the water ration barely covers drinking. Inside the city, the Union Army of the Cumberland is dying by the inch, not from bullets, from hunger. The Confederates under General Braxton Bragg have done something clever and cruel. They occupy the high ground on every side. They have cut every supply road into Chattanooga. 60,000 Union soldiers are trapped in this valley with their backs to the river and their mouths empty. The horses are eating sawdust and dying in the streets. Soldiers are stealing the corn from the animals' feed bags. Officers are writing letters home about the smell of dead mules rotting in the October mud. Men are going to bed at night, wondering if they will be ordered to burn the supply wagons before surrendering the town. The Army has a new commander, General George Henry Thomas. He replaced the broken, humiliated Rosecrans just 5 days ago. It is not a celebration. It is a rescue operation. Thomas received his orders via telegram. He read them without blinking. He sat down and composed his reply. "We will hold the town till we starve." That sentence tells you everything you need to know about George Thomas. It is not a rallying cry. It is not the rhetoric of a man playing to the gallery. It is a flat statement of geometric fact. We are here. We will remain here. And we will die before we leave. Thomas was that kind of general. He was not flashy. He did not quote Napoleon over dinner. He did not charm reporters or write self-promotional dispatches. He was a Virginian who had chosen the Union when his state chose secession, and his own family in Southampton County had turned his portrait to the wall. He had paid a price for his loyalty that no Northerner could fully comprehend. And 6 weeks before this moment, at a creek crossing in northern Georgia called Chickamauga, he had paid it again. September 20th, 1863. The second day of the Battle of Chickamauga. The Union Army is collapsing. The Confederate General James Longstreet finds a gap in the Union line and drives a corps of veteran infantry through it. The sound is a roar, followed by a silence that is worse than the roar. Division after division of Union soldiers simply disintegrates. General Rosecrans himself, the commanding general, rides off the field in a panic. He will be seen weeping in Chattanooga. Officers tear their badges off and run. It is a rout of complete and total humiliation. Except on the left. On the left, George Thomas is still fighting. He gathers the fragments of broken units around him. He pulls them onto a horseshoe-shaped ridge called Snodgrass Hill. He places them behind rocks and fallen timber with the precision of a man laying bricks. And there, for 5 hours, with his right flank hanging in the air and no support coming from any direction, he holds. Confederate division after Confederate division throws itself at his position. They come in waves like water against a dam. Thomas holds. He holds while the sun moves across the sky. He holds until dark. He holds until the army can escape across the mountains to Chattanooga. The army gives him a name. They call him the Rock of Chickamauga. But now the Rock is stuck in a valley with 60,000 starving men and no road out. The man who arrives to save them rides into Chattanooga on the night of October 23rd, looking like he was assembled from spare parts. General Ulysses S. Grant's left ankle is swollen to the size of a grapefruit from a horse accident in New Orleans. He cannot put weight on it. He had to be lifted onto his horse. He is soaked through to the skin from a rainstorm that lasted the entire ride. He is in pain. He is exhausted, and he is furious. Not at the enemy, at what he sees. Grant rides slowly through the streets of Chattanooga in the dark, his staff clustered around him, lanterns throwing pools of yellow light across the mud. He sees the dead horses. He sees soldiers whose uniforms are reduced to rags. He sees the vacant, hollow expression of men who have been beaten and besieged and are beginning to accept, in the quiet part of their minds, that they might not survive the winter. Grant did not accept that. Grant had never accepted that. Acceptance was the disease that had rotted every Union commander in the East. He had diagnosed it, named it, and spent 2 years refusing to catch it. He was not here to observe the siege. He was here to break it. Immediately, he called a meeting with Thomas the following morning. This is where the story stops being about logistics and starts being about two different philosophies of war colliding in a candlelit room. Grant wanted to attack. Now. Not in a week. Now. He had studied the map. He saw the position at Brown's Ferry, a narrow bend in the Tennessee River west of the city that Confederate forces had left weakly held. He wanted to seize it. He wanted to open a supply line, what they would come to call the Cracker Line, before Bragg could respond. Speed was everything. Every day they waited was another day of starvation. Another 100 horses dead in the mud. Thomas listened. Thomas agreed the Brown's Ferry operation was correct. Thomas agreed on the objective. And then Thomas said something that stopped Grant cold. Not yet. The troops, Thomas told him, were not ready. They were too weak. The horses could not move the pontoons and the artillery without better feed. If they launched the operation now, on an army running on quarter rations with horses dying under the weight of their own harnesses, they would fail. And a failed operation wouldn't just cost lives. It would convince these men that there was no way out. It would finish what Chickamauga started. Grant stared at him. Grant, who had driven his army through the Mississippi mud. Grant, who had ignored the advice of every cautious general around him and strangled Vicksburg by sheer persistence. Grant, who believed that waiting was a form of surrender. He did not like what Thomas was telling him, but Thomas was not finished. He walked Grant through the supply inventory. He walked him through the condition of each division, regiment by regiment. He laid out the casualty rates, the ration deficits, the artillery ammunition counts. He spoke with the methodical precision of a man who had spent his entire career believing that facts did not care about your feelings or your impatience. And gradually, reluctantly, Grant understood. This was not Vicksburg. These men had been through something Vicksburg had never asked of them. They had been ambushed in the dark at Chickamauga. They had watched their army collapse around them. They had survived on the reputation of a single general's stubbornness and then been locked in a valley while winter came. They needed to believe they could win before they would fight like men who could win. The Cracker Line operation launched on the night of October 26th. General William Hazen crossed the river in pontoon boats in total darkness, drifted 4 miles downstream, and seized Brown's Ferry before dawn. It was textbook. It was perfect. It was exactly the kind of precision operation that required the men to be capable of precision. Thomas had been right. They weren't ready on October 24th. They were ready on October 26th. The supply wagons started rolling within days. The soldiers called them the cracker wagons after the hard bread inside. When the first ones arrived, men stood by the road and wept, not from relief, from the realization that they were not forgotten, that someone had come, that they were still an army. This is the foundation everything else is built on. The moment Grant learned to listen to Thomas, not always, not completely, but enough. November arrived. The plan for breaking the siege took shape through a series of meetings that were, by all accounts, uncomfortable. Grant wanted Sherman to do the heavy lifting. William Tecumseh Sherman, Grant's most trusted general, his oldest friend in the army, would bring his corps down from Bridgeport and strike the north end of Missionary Ridge. Hooker would take his corps and demonstrate on the south end, attacking a place called Lookout Mountain, and Thomas's Army of the Cumberland. Thomas's men would make a demonstration. They would advance to the base of Missionary Ridge and take the Confederate rifle pits sitting there in the valley, a few hundred yards from the main Confederate line. The purpose was to fix Bragg's attention in the center, to keep Bragg from stripping troops from the flanks to reinforce against Sherman. It was a supporting role, a feint. The Army of the Cumberland, Grant calculated, was not yet ready to carry the weight of a major assault. They had been beaten too recently. Their morale was fragile. Thomas said nothing publicly about this assessment. He accepted his orders. His men knew what the order was. Attack the rifle pits at the base of the ridge. Not the ridge. The pits. This is where the story becomes something that military historians still argue about in hushed tones. November the 24th. Hooker's men attack Lookout Mountain. The battle takes place in a thick morning fog, high up on the slopes, in cloud cover so dense that the soldiers on the valley floor cannot see the fighting. They can only hear it. Musket fire and cannon, muffled and strange, coming from somewhere inside the gray ceiling of clouds. The newspapers will call it the Battle Above the Clouds. It is a spectacular theatrical Union victory that decides nothing strategically except the momentum of the day. Sherman's attack on the north end of Missionary Ridge is a different story. November 25th, before dawn, Sherman's veterans cross the river and climb what they believe is the north end of the ridge. They are confident. These are the men of the Army of the Tennessee, Grant's old army, the men who took Vicksburg. They expect to drive down the ridge from north to south, rolling up Bragg's line like a rug. But the maps are wrong. What Sherman climbs is not the north end of the ridge. It is a detached hill separated from the main ridge by a steep ravine. He is in the wrong position entirely. The Confederate division of General Patrick Cleburne holds the actual north end of the ridge, and it is, by any military measure, one of the most gifted defensive fighters in the Confederate Army. Sherman attacks. Cleburne destroys him. Wave after wave of Union soldiers assault the position and fall back, bloodied and stalled. Miles away on Orchard Knob, a small hill in the center of the valley, Grant watches through field glasses and understands that his plan is failing. Sherman is pinned. The grand flanking attack has become a grinding frontal assault against the wrong objective. He turns to Thomas. The order is given. Attack the rifle pits. Now, relieve the pressure on Sherman. Grant gives the order with the expectation that it will be a diversion, a demonstration, enough noise in the center to pull Confederate attention away from the north. Thomas passes the order down. The signal guns fire. 6 guns, the agreed signal. The sound rolls across the valley. What happens next is one of the most studied, disputed, and remarkable events in the entire Civil War. 20,000 soldiers of the Army of the Cumberland step out of their positions at the base of the valley. They form their lines, they fix bayonets, they begin to walk toward the Confederate rifle pits, 400 yards away across open ground. The Confederate artillery opens from the top of the ridge, 500 feet above them. Shell bursts blossom in the formation. Men fall. The lines close up and keep moving. The pace quickens. Some units begin to run. The rebel yell goes up from both sides simultaneously. The Confederates screaming it as a taunt. The Union soldiers screaming it back because they are through being afraid. They hit the rifle pits like a wave hitting a wall. It is over in minutes. The Confederate forward position collapses. Thousands of prisoners are taken. The rifle pits are seized, the order has been fulfilled. And then something happens that nobody ordered. The men don't stop. They look up. The Confederate soldiers from the rifle pits are running up the ridge toward the main line. And without any signal, without any command from any officer at any level, the Army of the Cumberland begins to follow them. Up the 500-foot slope of Missionary Ridge, into the concentrated fire of the entire Confederate line, into what should be a slaughterhouse. There are explanations historians have offered. The men were exposed in the valley below. The rifle pits were a death trap once taken because the Confederate artillery from above could plunge fire directly into them. The safest direction, paradoxically, was up. Some officers shouted forward, some followed their instincts in their fury. 6 weeks of Chickamauga humiliation and Chattanooga starvation transforming into something that could not be stopped with an order or a bugle. On Orchard Knob, Grant watches this happen and his face goes still. He turns to Thomas. His voice is flat and hard. Who ordered those men up the ridge? Thomas does not flinch. He looks at the smoke and the climbing tide of blue uniforms. His voice is steady. I don't know. I did not. Grant turns to General Gordon Granger, the Corps commander standing nearby. Did you order it? Granger shakes his head. The silence between them stretches for a moment that seems to last longer than it does. Grant speaks again, and those who were present never forgot what he said. It had the cold logic of a man calculating all possible outcomes in real time. It is all right if it turns out all right, but if it goes wrong, someone is going to sweat for this. On the ridge, it does not go wrong. The Confederate line breaks. It breaks in a way that defies the mathematical certainty of its construction. The Confederates have spent weeks building that line. They have artillery, they have natural fortifications, they have the high ground in the most literal, devastating sense. They have every advantage that defensive warfare can provide. And the Army of the Cumberland goes through them like they are made of paper. The Confederate soldiers panic. Some later say they couldn't fire down the slope properly, that the angle was too steep and they kept overshooting. Some say the sight of the men coming without stopping broke something in the psychology of the defense. Some say Bragg had placed his infantry on the military crest, not the actual crest, which meant the attackers had a brief blind spot on the final approach. None of these explanations are fully satisfying, and perhaps they shouldn't be. Some things happen in war that pure mechanics cannot explain. Bragg's army streams off the ridge. It is a rout. Confederate guns are abandoned, turned, fired back at the retreating Confederates by Union soldiers who don't even know how to load them properly. The screaming and the smoke and the impossible sight of the Army of the Cumberland standing on top of Missionary Ridge as the sun goes down over the Tennessee River. Grant rides forward. He does not celebrate. He sends orders for pursuit. But there is a moment, just a moment, on that November evening when he looks at what Thomas's men have done, and something shifts in his understanding. He came here believing, in the calculus of generals, that the Army of the Cumberland was the weakest element of his command. He shaped his entire battle plan around that belief. He put Thomas in the supporting role for that reason. He was wrong. Thomas never said so. That is the essential nature of the man. He did not write a triumphant dispatch claiming credit. He did not brief the reporters. He sat down, calculated his losses, reorganized his divisions, and prepared to continue the campaign. He let the results speak. What the charge up Missionary Ridge tells us about Thomas is not simply that his men were capable of more than Grant expected. It tells us something about the psychology of command that is more complex and uncomfortable than most histories are willing to say plainly. Thomas did not order the charge. He did not stop it either. He watched it develop from Orchard Knob, read it faster than anyone else in the command group, and made the calculation that no officer is supposed to make in the middle of a battle. He chose not to intervene. In a situation where intervening, pulling the men back to the rifle pits after the objective was taken, would have been the textbook response, where it would have been the legally correct response, where it would have spared him any accountability for what happened next, he did not do it. Because he understood something Grant was still learning. He understood that there are moments in the life of an army when the mathematics of tactics gives way to something else entirely. He understood that these particular men, in this particular valley, on this particular day, had accumulated enough compressed fury and hunger and shame that they were operating outside the normal boundaries of what soldiers can be ordered to do. And he let them go. There is a difference between the general who shapes the battle and the general who understands when the battle has escaped the shape you gave it and chooses, with full knowledge of the risk, to follow where it leads. Thomas did not refuse Grant's order. He fulfilled it. And then he allowed something beyond the order to happen, because he knew his men in a way that Grant, who had only been in Chattanooga for a month, could not yet know them. Grant spent the rest of his life respecting Thomas while never fully trusting him. He found Thomas too slow, too deliberate, too unwilling to take the kind of slashing offensive risk that Grant believed ended wars quickly. In the campaigns that followed, Grant would chafe against Thomas's methodical approach the way a fast river chafes against a wide stone. He would nearly relieve Thomas of command before Thomas won the most complete tactical victory of the entire war, the destruction of Confederate General John Bell Hood's army at the Battle of Nashville in December 1864. He would win it slowly, on his own timeline, with the precision of a man who had never, in 40 years of soldiering, been in a hurry to be wrong. Chattanooga was captured, the siege was broken, the road to Atlanta was open, and it was accomplished in its decisive moment by an army that had been consigned to the supporting role acting entirely on its own authority. The men who climbed Missionary Ridge that November afternoon were not following a general's order. They were following something older and harder to define. They were following the memory of Chickamauga. They were following 6 weeks of eating sawdust and watching their horses die. They were following the knowledge, deep in the bone, that they were still soldiers and that soldiers climb hills. Grant asked who ordered them up. Nobody did, and that in the end is the answer that matters. Because the men who win wars are not always the men who follow orders. Sometimes they are the men who understand, at the exact right moment, that the order has already been given. Not by any general standing on any hill with any field glass. By the weight of everything that came before. By the mathematics of debt and fury and endurance. By the particular cold mercy of a November afternoon in a Tennessee valley, where a rock that refused to move at Chickamauga finally moved. And it moved up.